Welcome back, everyone, to the Health Z podcast. This is Logan here, along with Luna.
Hey, everyone.
So you're maybe trying to get a handle on what's actually in your food, but, without needing a chemistry degree.
Right. It can feel overwhelming sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So today, we're doing a deep dive into something you've probably seen on ingredient lists: hydrogenated oils.
Yep, those ones.
Our goal here is basically to cut through the noise, give you the essentials so you can make smarter choices.
Think of it like a quick guide. We'll unpack what they are, why they were everywhere in our food for a while.
And the health stuff too, right? The concerns.
Absolutely. The health concerns, the big changes that happen because of them, and most importantly, how we can figure things out today, reading labels and all that.
Okay, cool. So let's start right at the beginning. What are hydrogenated oils? Because, the name itself sounds a bit intense.
It does, yeah. But in simple terms, they start out as liquid vegetable oils. Think like soybean oil, canola oil, that kind of thing.
The stuff you cook with normally.
Exactly. And they get transformed chemically into a solid or maybe a semi-solid state.
So like taking regular oil and making it spreadable, like butter, or firm, like shortening.
That's a perfect way to put it. Yeah, making it behave differently at room temperature.
Okay. Now, how do they actually do that? What's the magic trick to making liquid oil solid?
It's a process called hydrogenation. No magic, just chemistry, involving hydrogen gas.
Hydrogen, okay.
They bubble this gas through the oil, usually under pretty high heat and pressure, and they often use a catalyst like nickel to speed it all up.
Right.
See, vegetable oils are liquid, partly because they have these unsaturated bonds in their structure. Adding hydrogen sort of fills those up, makes them more saturated.
And more saturated means more solid.
Basically, yes.
Yep.
It changes the structure so the oil becomes more solid or semi-solid when it cools down. So fundamentally, adding hydrogen makes the oil harder and also helps it last longer.
That makes sense. Now, I've definitely heard the term partially hydrogenated oils.
Mm-hmm.
Is that different from just hydrogenated?
Yes, absolutely different. And it's a really crucial distinction. There are two main types we need to know.
Okay.
Partially hydrogenated oils, or PHOs, as you'll see them called, are where they don't complete the process fully. The oil ends up semi-solid.
Right.
And here's the key thing. PHOs contain artificial trans fats. That's the big health concern we'll get into.
Okay. The trans fats and the other type.
That's fully hydrogenated oils. Here, the process goes all the way. It results in a very solid fat, almost like wax sometimes. And importantly, fully hydrogenated oils don't contain trans fats.
So it's like stopping halfway versus going the full distance.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. Partial versus full hydrogenation makes a huge difference, especially regarding trans fats.
Okay, got the what. Now, the why. Why did food companies bother with all this hydrogenation stuff in the first place? What were the big selling points for them?
Well, there were three main advantages that made them really attractive to the food industry.
Okay, number one.
Shelf life. Dramatically longer shelf life. Hydrogenated oils resist oxidation, meaning they don't go rancid nearly as quickly as liquid oils.
So products could sit on shelves or in pantries for ages.
Precisely. A massive benefit for packaged foods, reduced spoilage, all that.
Makes sense from a business angle. What was reason number two?
Texture. This was a really big one. PHOs, especially, gave foods this really desirable mouthfeel.
Like what?
Think about the creaminess in old-style margarine or some peanut butters, or that crispiness in crackers, cookies, fried foods. PHOs helped achieve that texture.
Right, that specific feel we kind of expect from certain foods. I get it. And the third reason?
Cost. Pretty simple, really. Vegetable oils, like soybean, are generally much cheaper than animal fats. Butter, lard, things like that.
So hydrogenation let them use these cheap oils but get properties like the more expensive fats.
You nailed it. They could mimic the texture and stability of animal fats using less expensive plant-based sources. So yeah, it was often a more economical choice.
Okay, longer life, better texture, lower cost. Makes sense why they popped up everywhere. Where would we typically find them? Like what kinds of foods?
Oh, they were in a lot of processed foods back in the day. Margarine is the classic example, of course.
Right.
Many commercial baked goods, cookies, cakes, pies, pastries relied heavily on them for texture and to prevent oil separation.
Snack foods, too.
Definitely. Things like crackers, some types of chips, microwave popcorn, and they were very common for deep frying, both in restaurants and for frozen fried foods you'd buy.
Okay, so pretty ubiquitous for a while there. Now, let's get to the part where things started to unravel health-wise.
Yeah.
You mentioned trans fats earlier. Let's really dig into the downsides and eventually the bans.
Yeah, this is where we really need to focus back on those partially hydrogenated oils, the PHOs,
Right.
because the major health risks are tied directly to the artificial trans fats created during that partial process.
Even small amounts were a problem.
Yes, even relatively small amounts were shown to have significant negative effects. It wasn't something you needed a lot of to see the impact.
So what exactly do these trans fats do in our bodies that's so bad?
The biggest, most well-established impact is on cholesterol levels. Trans fats do a double whammy. They raise your LDL cholesterol, that's the bad kind,
Right.
and they lower your HDL cholesterol, the good protective kind.
Oh, okay, so it messes up the balance completely.
Exactly. And that imbalance is a major driver for heart disease risk. It increases your chances of developing clogged arteries, leading to heart attacks and strokes.
Wow. Are there, like, numbers on that? How much risk?
Yeah, the research is pretty stark. Some large studies linked higher trans fat intake to something like a 21% higher risk of coronary heart disease.
21%. Wow.
And maybe even more concerning, a 28% increased risk of death from heart-related causes. So,
Uh-huh.
not trivial effects.
Definitely not. I think I remember hearing about other issues, too, beyond just heart health.
You're right. There's also strong evidence linking trans fat consumption to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes.
How does that work?
It seems to interfere with insulin sensitivity, making it harder for your body to regulate blood sugar properly. One big study, particularly in women, found a significantly higher diabetes risk among those eating the most trans fats.
Okay, so heart disease, diabetes risk. Anything else?
Well, there's also the link to inflammation. Trans fats seem to promote chronic, low-grade inflammation throughout the body.
And inflammation is tied to lots of chronic diseases, isn't it?
It really is. Heart disease, diabetes, arthritis, potentially others too, so that inflammatory effect is another major concern.
Okay, that covers PHOs and trans fats. What about the fully hydrogenated ones? You said they don't have trans fats. Are they okay then?
Well, okay is relative. They avoid the trans fat problem, which is good, but
Mhm.
they are very, very high in saturated fats.
Right, and saturated fat is still something we're told to limit.
Generally, yes. While the science on saturated fat is maybe more nuanced now than it used to be, high intake can still raise LDL cholesterol for many people.
So it still contributes to heart disease risk if you eat too much.
It can, yeah. Guidelines, like from the American Heart Association, still suggest limiting saturated fat often to less than 10% of your daily calories. Fully hydrogenated oils are almost entirely saturated fat, so they contribute significantly to that total if you consume foods made with them.
So even without trans fats, they're not exactly a health food.
Yeah.
Got it. Were there any other, maybe less proven risks linked to trans fats?
There's been some research looking into other potential links, things like weight gain, maybe some digestive issues, even suggestions of connections to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
But that's less certain.
Exactly. More research is really needed to confirm those links definitively. The evidence is strongest, really solid for the cardiovascular risks and the diabetes connection.
Okay, so the science, especially on PHOs, became pretty clear and damning, which leads us to the rules changing. What did the FDA actually do?
It was a big move. In 2015, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, officially determined that partially hydrogenated oils were no longer generally recognized as safe, or GRS.
GRAS, right. I've heard that term. So taking away that GRAS status was huge.
It was the essential step. It meant they couldn't just be freely added to foods anymore. The FDA then set a deadline for manufacturers.
Which was?
They had until June 18, 2018 to stop adding PHOs to new food products. There was a bit of an extension, like a final compliance date of January 1st, 2021, mainly to let products already made work their way through the supply chain.
So effectively, since the start of 2021, PHOs are banned from being intentionally added to foods in the U.S.
That's the gist of it, yes. That includes foods sold in grocery stores and foods prepared in restaurants. The primary source of artificial trans fats has been removed from the U.S. food supply.
Okay, that sounds like a massive public health win. Does that mean we just don't need to worry about trans fats at all anymore in the U.S.?
Mostly, yes. The artificial kind from PHOs are gone. But it's good to know a couple of things. First, small amounts of trans fats occur naturally in some meat and dairy products. That's different from the artificial ones.
Okay, natural versus artificial.
Right. And second, labeling laws allow products with less than 0.5 grams of trans fat per serving to be labeled as 0-gram trans fat.
Ah, so there could still be tiny amounts even if the label says 0.
Potentially, yes, if you eat multiple servings. Also, very high temperature frying with certain oils can still create some trans fats, though usually much less than PHOs contained. But yeah, the widespread PHO issue is largely resolved here.
What about elsewhere? Is the U.S. unique, or have other countries done similar things?
Many other developed countries have taken action, definitely. The European Union, for instance, set a strict limit on trans fats in foods back in April 2021.
Which effectively bans PHOs too.
Pretty much, yeah, because PHOs usually contain more trans fat than the EU limit allows. Canada actually banned PHOs outright in 2018, similar to the US timeline.
Any early adopters?
Denmark, they were way ahead of the curve, putting restrictions on industrial trans fats way back in 2003. Real pioneers there.
Wow, 2003. But it's not universal.
No, not everywhere. China, for example, doesn't currently have a nationwide ban on PHOs, though regulations might vary regionally. And there's growing awareness. They're still used in some products there.
Okay. And fully hydrogenated oils, are they still legal everywhere?
As far as I know, yes. Because they don't contain the trans fats, they haven't faced the same regulatory bans as PHOs. They're still used globally.
Right. So the landscape has changed a lot, especially in places like the U.S. and Europe, but maybe not everywhere, and fully hydrogenated oils are still around. This brings us to the practical stuff for listeners. How can you navigate food choices today to avoid these less desirable fats?
Yeah, good question. With PHOs mostly gone in the US, it's easier, but vigilance is still smart. The absolute number one thing is reading ingredient labels carefully.
Looking for what exactly?
Look for the words hydrogenated oil or fully hydrogenated oil. Even if the nutrition facts panel says 0 gram trans fat, like we discussed, check that ingredient list. If you see partially hydrogenated, that product is likely old stock or from somewhere without a ban, definitely avoid it. If you see fully hydrogenated, just be aware it's a source of saturated fat.
So the ingredient list tells the real story, beyond just the trans fat number. Got it. What else?
Prioritize whole, unprocessed foods whenever possible. Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, lean meats, fish. These naturally don't contain hydrogenated oils or artificial trans fats.
Makes sense. Base your diet on those.
Exactly. And as a consequence, try to limit your intake of heavily processed foods. Packaged snacks, commercial baked goods, some margarines, fast food. These are the categories where you might still find fully hydrogenated oils or where PHOs used to be common.
Okay, so limiting processed stuff helps avoid them by default. What about cooking at home?
Yeah, when you cook, choose healthier liquid oils. Olive oil, avocado oil, canola oil, sunflower oil. These are good choices, rich in unsaturated fats. No hydrogenation needed.
And if buying packaged foods?
Look for labels that say trans fat free. But like I said, always double check the ingredient list just to be sure they haven't used fully hydrogenated oils instead. Look for oils you recognize, like sunflower or palm oil listed plainly, not as hydrogenated.
Right. Verify the claim. What about eating out? That feels trickier. You don't see the ingredient list.
It is trickier, yeah. Fried foods are the main thing to be aware of there. While restaurants in the U.S. shouldn't be using PHOs for frying anymore, the type of oil they do use can vary. Some might still use oils high in saturated fat, maybe even fully hydrogenated shortening in some cases, though less common now.
So maybe ask. Or just choose other options.
Asking is always an option. You can ask what kind of oil they use for frying. If you're unsure or concerned, opting for grilled, baked, steamed, or roasted dishes instead of deep fried is generally a safer bet for avoiding less healthy fats.
Okay, those are some really practical tips for the grocery store and restaurants.
Definitely. It really boils down to being an informed consumer, reading labels, choosing whole foods more often. The regulations on PHOs were a huge step, but understanding labels helps you navigate the remaining landscape, especially regarding fully hydrogenated oils and overall saturated fat.
So that's our deep dive into hydrogenated oils. We've gone through what they are, the why behind their use, the serious health concerns, particularly with PHOs and trans fats, and the big regulatory shifts. Hopefully this makes things a lot clearer.
Yeah, and it's quite a story, isn't it? How a food technology aimed at improving texture and shelf life ended up having such significant public health consequences.
Definitely shows how science and regulation have to work together.
It really does. And how our understanding evolves. It makes you think about what we're consuming.
Absolutely. So a final thought for you listening. Now that you know more about hydrogenated oils and trans fats, how might this change things for you? Maybe your next grocery run or when you're deciding what to order. It's interesting to consider how these fats were sort of hidden in plain sight for so long.
And perhaps think about this. As food science keeps advancing, What other ingredients, maybe ones we think are perfectly fine now, might come under scrutiny in the future? It's a constant learning process.
Thanks again for joining us, everybody. Stay healthy and see you here next time.